Hello, Martial Arts Journey Tribe, and my dog is usually saying hi, but I think he actually closed the door for himself. So, Balsam. There you go. Okay, that's covered. We can continue. So I'm super excited today since we have a guest who has literally changed my life, and I'm talking about Matt Thornton, a lifetime martial artist, world-renowned critical thinker in martial arts, founder of SBG International, high-level BJJ black belt, and many years ago a Jeet Kune Do instructor. Matt has been a key person in introducing me to the importance of critical thinking, and he's also been a catalyst in my decision to close down my Aikido school, which is one of the best decisions I ever made, so I'm very grateful for that. And also in devoting myself to combat sports and exploration of truth in martial arts. If you've seen the updated slogan on the Martial Arts Journey channel, it's now exploring truth in martial arts. I kind of stole that from Matt, but I have a feeling he won't mind. But that's where it comes from. And today we'll be discussing why Matt left Jeet Kune Do many years ago, how he introduced the importance of aliveness to the martial arts world, why critical thinking is so important in martial arts and outside of martial arts, why so many people apparently lack it, and much more. Also, stay until the end, since at the end of and at the second half of our talk, we'll be answering your live questions, which you can ask in the chat. Don't rush to do that yet. You can just chat between yourselves, but I'll mention when the chat opens up for questions, and then we'll address as many as we can. If you want your question to stand out, there's a super chat option, like a button. You can check that out. So without further ado, I invite you to grab your preferred beverage, and let's get this journey started. So, hello, Matt. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I'm good. We had a bit of a chance to talk, but things seem to be going well. Lockdown is slowing down.
It is. We're getting signups again. Things are slowly returning back to normal, so that's good.
Nice. Very cool. So I said this brief introduction, the one I came up with from what I know. Many things I didn't mention because I find your background is so full and colorful. There's so many things. One more thing which is on top of my mind is that it's a phrase, I think it's on your website, that SBG gyms are in all continents besides Antarctica or
That's true.
which is really cool.
Yeah.
But my question that I wanted to start with, so let's say if somebody asks you about your martial arts background, what's your brief version of the answer?
Yeah, it depends totally on who's asking. But when I do podcasts and I'm talking about critical thinking and martial arts, very often I'll start with my Jeet Kune Do background, because what they want to know about is what caused me to, move towards aliveness and towards Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and towards functional martial arts. That's what I would start with. In reality, I've always been obsessed with martial arts since I knew they existed. I love martial arts. I would go to the library and look at the martial arts books and magazines. My dad put me in karate, very traditional karate, for I think a year. I didn't really like that. I went into boxing just before I was in the military, and then while I was in the military. And when I got out of the military, I wanted to pursue functional martial arts. And from the research I had done, Jeet Kune Do seemed like the best route. Now, mind you, this is in the 80s. This is before MMA and everything. And the reason why I was going to go with Jeet Kune Do is because they used boxing hands, and I'd come to the conclusion that kickboxing was probably the most functional stand-up art. And they talked about Bruce Lee's philosophy anyway. He talked about fighting at all ranges. And I'd been in enough fights to know boxing doesn't work when somebody's sitting on your chest. And so that really appealed to me. And my goal from the very beginning with martial arts was I want to learn how to fight, and I want to learn what works in a fight. That's just been my interest, practical interest. So that's why I gravitated towards it. When I got out of the military, I sought it out. I found some instructors, ultimately wound up becoming an instructor and teaching it for a while after I moved here to Portland, Oregon. This would have been very late 80s, early 90s, so 91, something like that, 1990. And and we can talk more about whatever detail you want, but long story short, I became very disillusioned with what I saw. I was granted an opportunity to meet most of the more famous high-level instructors in Jeet Kune Do concepts. Some became friends, some I was friends with, some I didn't like, but I was disillusioned by what I saw. I saw a lot of duplicity and hypocrisy. Most of all, I just felt like the people that I was around and those instructors weren't interested in the same thing I was interested in. Going back to my original interest is what works in a fight. And that's what I wanted to find out. And right around that time, as I was starting to become disillusioned with it, I ran into Gracie Jiu-Jitsu via Fabio Santos, who was one of Hickson's black belts who just happened to be living up here, and Hickson Gracie, who I met. And that immediately captured my attention. It was everything I'd been looking for, everything I felt I was missing, that boxing and kickboxing didn't have. And that's what made me open up my own schools, just to create training partners. I just wanted people to train with. And that became the beginning of SBG.
Well, you mentioned, which is interesting, that you started off looking for basically truth in martial arts, something which is functional. But Jeet Kune Do sounds very good, let's say, like on paper, or when you hear about it, the whole take what works, disregard what doesn't. I'm pretty bad with quotes, but everybody knows the Bruce Lee quote.
Mao
So
Zedong, actually.
Sorry?
That's a Mao Zedong quote that Bruce took.
Oh, right. I think I heard you once mention that. So I think so that being the essence of Jeet Kune Do, why do you think? Where did it go wrong? Do you personally think?
Yeah, it's a good question. Burton Richardson and I have talked about this quite a few times. I think that the natural state for martial arts, if you take aliveness out, my ultimate answer to these questions is always aliveness. If you remove aliveness from the equation, the natural state for martial arts and just about anything else is to devolve back into a set of fixed patterns. It's just the human nature. It's the way things work, and that's ultimately what happened. And when I say Jeet Kune Do is a broad, general term. There are different camps within the Jeet Kune Do community. So you had the Jeet Kune Do concepts community, which was headed up by Dan Inosanto, generally agreed upon to be kind of the leader of that group. And that was the group that I was teaching and affiliated with at the time, instructors under him. And then you had what's called the original Jeet Kune Do, or Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do, which were some of the guys that had trained when Bruce Lee was alive, and their focus was preserving more of what Bruce Lee actually did. And both of them were wrong and are wrong, but for different reasons. So the problem with the Jeet Kune Do concepts community is, I'll give you an example. Dan Inosanto wrote a book. It's actually a very good book called Absorb What Is Useful. And it was one of the Jeet Kune Do books that I liked that made me interested in the art. And in it, he has side-by-side picture comparisons of supposed with boxing and some very practical examples. Boxers have their hands up, karate person's here, the boxing line is more efficient, body mechanics, everything. He's explaining in a scientific sense why if you're going to punch somebody in the head, you want to go this route and not this route, with side-by-side pictures, which I think is what we should be doing in martial arts, because I think we should be taking a scientific approach to it. And the pictures had people like Paul Vunak and other people in them. And that was what I was interested in. And that existed in the Jeet Kune Do concepts community. But side by side with that, they teach a few minutes of something like that. And then side by side with that, they teach something that was even more ridiculous than the traditional karate. Some of the Penjak Silat and some of the things they would teach were just silly. There's no other way to put it. And so there was no discernment. It was like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Some of it is nutritious. Some of it's just garbage. If you listen to him talk, he would say, yeah, if you really want to learn how to fight, focus on your Muay Thai and this. But then they would have all this other stuff. And to me, anybody that has followed the way I think about it, what I think about it is in terms of delivery systems. You have a stand-up clinch and ground. There's only so many ways you can hold somebody in the clinch. You can break those down. How many, over, under, body lock, over, under hooks, over hooks. You break it all down, single neck tie, double neck tie. And the functional grappling arts that deal with clinch, about judo, Greco-Roman wrestling, Sambo, the list goes on. Most old cultures, grappling art, all have similar body mechanics, assuming functional martial arts, because there's only so many you can throw somebody, for example, do it efficiently, and they figured it out, right? And so learning the delivery system of the clinch and understanding the body mechanics that allow a small person to a bigger person clinch, to me, is what. Same thing with ground, which is basically what the Brazilian on the ground. Same thing with standing. But that's not what it was. Instead, it was like a cultural, like I said, all you can eat buffet. There was a little bit of nutritious food, and there's a whole junk food. Now, the other side of that is the Jeet Kune Do, original Jeet Kune Do. I love Bruce Lee. He was an icon. I'm a huge fan. I still am. He died when he was 30 years old in 1973. The amount of things he was able to see compared to what we know now about martial arts is very, very limited. And so to take someone else's style and try and mimic that, I think, number one, that's always a mistake. I don't think any two fighters are meant to fight the same way. Every MMA fighter needs to develop his or her own style. So trying to mimic the way a 133-pound guy fought in 1972, I think, is a bit silly. It's not to say he didn't have things that he discovered that were worthwhile, but that should be a starting point, and then, of course, you would build onto that ground and clinch and all the other things. And that didn't happen. We just kind of hung up on that aspect of it. So between the two, I just didn't see either was taking a scientific approach to martial arts, and that's why I realized I'm just going to have to do my own thing, and that again is when I started my school.
Well, one thing you mentioned is and I wonder how big part of it all was the preserving, the desire to preserve. And I kind of get a feeling that happens with martial arts fairly occasionally when there's this iconic figure. And it definitely was a case with Aikido. The founder of Aikido is just kind of godified. He's legendary. There's stories of him dodging bullets. And many of the instructors, both Japanese and Westerners, they would be all about preserving what he taught, kind of having this idea that he was the perfect version. So it sounds like that might have happened with Jeet Kune Do as well. Would you say that that's true?
And yeah, that's true. And again, that's what happens, especially when you take aliveness out of it. So I was actually having a conversation with one of the original, or I shouldn't say that. I don't want to pigeonhole him, but one of the very old school Jeet Kune Do guys. He's been around since Bruce Lee was alive, trained primarily right after Bruce Lee died in Dan Inosanto's very first crop of students that came out. And they did sparring and they did kickboxing and they did some very functional things. But what I could tell when I was talking to him, what I could tell is he did not understand grappling. He doesn't understand the ground. He doesn't understand position before submission. There's some very obvious things that modern MMA fighters and modern grapplers know that I could just, and I don't mean any offense, but he just didn't get it. And in his defense, he's older and probably has never trained it that way because not capable of it at this age. But because of that, there's this idea that they focus so much on this first punch, this first strike, that intercepting strike, and the power they're going to develop in it, and then that's it. And then to me, that's like, okay, you've gotten off the first shot. That the party has just started. Now what are you going to do? Because this guy's going to tackle you. This guy's going to punch back. You're going to be on the ground. This is what every MMA fighter knows. The idea that you can rely on knocking someone out, and that's going to be the end of the fight, is just obviously a huge fallacy when we have people walking around like Dan Henderson and other people who you're not going to hit him and knock him out with a single punch probably. And this, what happens after when the guy tackles you and you're rolling around on the ground and you have to now be able to control the position, their answer to that is, well, we're going to take out an eyeball. We're going to go after this. And you realize very quickly they don't understand. They don't understand that aspect of fighting. And the reason why they don't understand that aspect of fighting is because they just took it out. When they did their sparring, they clearly didn't let it go, the way the Brazilians did, where two guys fight, and they're going to fight until somebody submits, and nobody's going to come in and interrupt. And in that laboratory, they developed Gracie Jiu-Jitsu because it's a very functional way of determining, what happens in a one-on-one fight. So when you take that aspect out, that aliveness out, and you start limiting what you're allowing to have happen, then obviously everything starts to break down. Now, if you take the sparring completely out of it, which with an art like Aikido they did, then you're not going to have anything functional after probably 10 years. Very quickly, you're just going to have, it's very much going to be like a religion. What you described to me when you were describing Aikido is a religion. There's a saint, and he has his miracles that he performed, and he's achieved a level that no one else can achieve. And there's a lot of hypocrisy there too, because they'll look down on people who want to understand functional martial arts. But what really is the measurement they're using for him? That he was super functional martial arts, right? He was supposed to be a super badass. Yeah. You can't be, but he was back in the day. Take our word for it and go repeat these patterns. It's religion. And I think that's pretty natural default state for people to fall into the moment you remove aliveness.
So, from what I understand, Jeet Kune Do does have an element of sparring, but it's very conditional?
Well, again, broad term, right? So you have some guys in the Jeet Kune Do community who are great fighters, and the first one that comes to mind is Eric Paulson. But Eric Paulson is a great kickboxer who learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu very early on. He was doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before I was, and Japanese shoot wrestling, which is a kind of form of MMA, right? So he has the skill sets, and you will have groups within the Jeet Kune Do community who will spar that way and do, for all intents and purposes, what is mixed martial arts. What I meant earlier was more along the lines of the older school original Jeet Kune Do guys. It's very clear to me that they became very focused on the first couple minutes, not even that, first couple seconds of a fight, intercepting that shot and then being able to hit really, really hard. And that's a useful skill, right? But ultimately, when you're dealing with somebody who's tough, that's just going to be the beginning. That's going to be the beginning if you're fighting Conor McGregor, right? So maybe you do hit him first and hit him really hard. Now you've got to deal with him on the ground or in the clinch or wherever it is. And so they didn't carry it up past that point. In the Jeet Kune Do concepts community, you'd have some people like Eric and others who did functional training, but you'd also have a whole lot of people who just weren't interested in that, and they wanted to collect certificates and click sticks together and basically just collect patterns that they would compare back and forth with each other. And to them, that was learning. And it really had absolutely nothing to do with functional fighting skill. When I came back to the Jeet Kune Do school I was teaching at after having met Hickson, I explained to them what had happened. I watched this guy sit in a room full of large men who were a good portion of whom were judo black belts, and submit them one after the other without using his hands. Didn't use his hands, and he made them tap out. It wasn't choreographed. It wasn't a demonstration. It's come do whatever you want, come grab me, try and choke me, try and break my arm. And one after the other, he submitted them without using his hands. His hands were in his belt, without breaking a sweat. Like, that's where this guy is, right? So I come back and I tell them that. There's video of it, and they're not interested. They're back to a secret Silat Juru that's going to allow them to fight somebody in this. It's just, they're looking for that magic bullet. They were more interested in the silly parts of martial arts than the functional parts. And that's when I realized it's just not we do not share values that way.
And I imagine that's a difficult thing to answer what I'm about to ask, but I'm wondering what's your take. So there are those people who are more interested in that magical bullet and these mystical sides of things. Do you have an opinion why some people are just leaning towards that so hard?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people that are attracted to martial arts are attracted to martial arts because maybe they were beat up when they were younger, they were a kid. They weren't they weren't natural athletes, for lack of a better term. They weren't the tough kids. Sometimes they are, but very often you get nerdy kids or kids that got picked on. That would have been me too.
Me too.
Yeah, I was interested in martial arts before I got beat up in school, but I definitely got bullied for a period of time when I was in school, and that helped fuel my interest in wanting to learn how to fight, for sure. And there's a whole bunch of people just like me. If you talk to a lot of martial arts instructors, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts, I think a lot of them will probably tell you the same story. Now, when you take a kid like me, somebody like that, and you put them in a combat sport, and it doesn't have to be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It could be wrestling, could be judo, boxing, any combat sport, any functional martial art, which, as you know, when I say that, I mean combat sport, because those are the functional martial arts. If you put them in that environment, after 2 or 3 or 4 years of training, you learn what you can do, you learn what you can't do, you learn to be comfortable with your body, you gain a certain confidence that can't really be faked, because it's the kind of confidence that comes from competence, the ability to handle yourself physically, because you do it in the gym on a regular basis. So the allure of street fighting and the romanticizing of it, the fear of it, the fetishizing of it, that just kind of starts to fade away naturally, because you're actually doing it in the gym, right? And it's a healthy thing. And then over time, especially if that gym, at that combat sports gym, is also filled with other mature males who, behave themselves in a manner that's worthy, that could be a great thing for kids that get picked on. That could be a great thing for everybody to learn really positive skill sets for life. Now, if you take those same kids and you put them in a non-functional martial art, whatever it is, Aikido, Wing Chun, you name it, right?
Yeah.
They're gonna be told they're learning how to fight by people who are posturing, who are probably just like them, but who still have never learned how to fight. And as a consequence, those guys, their instructors, and ultimately them, will wind up having to defend a position which is indefensible because it's based on a fraud. And that doesn't make people healthier. It doesn't make people more confident. And over time, I think it takes kids who may be scared and a little bit insecure, and it makes them scared, insecure assholes, right?
Yeah.
And so on one route, you can put them in just a healthy combat sport, and everything becomes better for them. And in another route, you stick them in the fantasy-based martial art, and it can become a real trap. And then there's a constant search for the magic bullet. You can see it in Jeet Kune Do now as they go through fads. Like the most recent silly thing I could see they were gravitating towards was Sistema.
Yes.
Sistema's fucking ridiculous. You know that, I know that, right? Anybody that watches it knows it. But because it's so ridiculous, it's actually more appealing to those people because it doesn't look like MMA. It doesn't look like something that would be functional. And so maybe they have some secret that those MMA guys, those jocks, maybe they have a secret those guys don't know, and they're going to pull from it, right? If it looked like Muay Thai or it looked like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they probably wouldn't be interested. But then they see something that looks like The Matrix, like a John Wick movie, then they become fascinated by it and they want to explore it under the auspices of it must have something cool to reveal. And the guys that teach that stuff, the old fat Russians that teach the system and everything else, that are making a million, several million a year, passing on this fraud, they know that. They know how to market it, how to appeal to those people, put on the camouflage and talk about Spetsnaz and all that bullshit. And they exploit those people using that kind of nonsense. And so there's a part of me always, because there's a lot of really good people. I've had people in years past that go, why do you even say anything? Like, people will figure it out on their own, right? And kind of the thought process I think behind that is, if they're dumb enough to get fooled by something like Sistema or whatever, then they deserve it, right? And I just don't think that. I think that because I've met so many people who were sincere and who could have really benefited the sooner they got involved in combat sports, the better, and who were kind of led astray. And so there's a part of me that always wants to take those students I see in those Systema seminars getting bullshitted by some fat huckster and just bring them into a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or a wrestling clinic or something for a day or two and let them experience the difference between something real and something fantasy so that they can actually start to grow.
Yeah, that was definitely my case as well, and I really appreciate you explaining it that way, because I've been doing Aikido for more than a decade, but I always had an internal doubt. I always wasn't sure, and even if there was like a threatening situation, I was freaking out. I did BJJ and a bit of MMA for like 6 months. Obviously, that didn't make me very competent, but I could feel the inner confidence was much higher than after a decade of Aikido. But what was interesting is that, like you explained, there was always this kind of explanation that I will get there one day, and if I'm doubting things, then it's my problem, that it's the martial artist's fault, that it's not the martial art, that basically it's my problem that I have the doubts. But it just seems it's not true.
No.
And I'm also curious to ask you this, because, and I think, again, what I'm about to ask, it could be looked at in different ways, but one of the most common critiques I get from, obviously, fan boys and girls of traditional martial arts or fantasy-based martial arts, but they're saying that it's my fault as an individual versus the martial art.
Yeah,
I personally don't agree. But what's your opinion when somebody says that?
So that's a common trope. That one used to really bother me, especially when I heard it from. I heard Dan and Asano say a similar thing. Right? It's not the individual. It's not the style. It's the individual. All arts have something good. And it's up to the individual to make it work. And if they can't make it work, it's the individual's fault. And that's 100% bullshit. 100% bullshit. And I'll explain to you why. But first of all arts have something good, provided you don't clarify that statement a little more. The moment I say all arts have something good as it comes to actually being able to fight, that statement becomes 100% bullshit. Of course they don't. Some arts actually take you further away. And number two, think about it. Let's flip it around. Let's say you're a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor, you're a black belt, and you teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a few years, and your students go to a tournament, or they get in a fight, or they do MMA or whatever. They go someplace where they're dealing with fully resisting opponents from a different place, and they're constantly failing. Can't make anything they're doing work. Is that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor going to go, well, it's their fault? It's not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's not Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. It's them. They don't know how to do Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. They're just not tough enough. Of course not. Because every Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor in the world who's legit and awards a legitimate blue belt or purple belt to a student knows that blue belt or purple belt is going to wipe the floor with anybody else that doesn't have very good grappling. Every single time. Right? It's kind of a joke, but it really did. One of the ones that annoyed me would be, some people are fighters and some people aren't. And that's such a cop-out. One of my favorite memes is, I saw it on Facebook the other day, but it had like a super nerdy kid with like glasses and very skinny with his shirt all buttoned up. And he's riding one of those stand-up two-wheelers. I forget the name of them. And underneath, it's like, this is the guy that kicks your ass every day at the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school. 100%. I can name for you 100 kids that are exactly like that. They're gonna wipe the floor with these big, strong guys that walk in up because grappling Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu works. And you could say the same thing for boxing. There are levels. Not everybody's going to be a champion. Not everybody's going to be capable of getting gold medals. But make it work? Of course. Anybody can make wrestling and judo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai work. The only time you hear those kind of statements is when we're talking about a fantasy-based martial art. And what's sad, if you turn it around again, what's sad is if you get some kids believing that, right? And they take some bullshit martial art and then they go get beat up and they think, oh, it must be me. I'm not tough. I'm just not tough enough. No, you just didn't train with somebody that knows what they're doing. Come to my school. I'll teach you how to fight.
Yeah. Again, you make me think, and it's interesting that there's it seems like there's this stereotype, and probably like an old stereotype, of what a badass looks like, and if the person doesn't have that badass look, or the way he acts, like people think that, okay, he's not a fighter. And it's something that bugs me as well, still up to date sometimes, people, because I do agree and admit that I am more or less like a soft-spoken, calm individual, and some people take that as a sign, oh, you're not a fighter, you're just like not built for that. But the crazy thing is, like, if we look at the evidence, the more I train, the more better I become. I stay the same individual. I mean, I lost the ponytail, yes, but but then still, I'm a calm person, individual. But then now, if I roll with a white belt or a beginner, I'll obviously be, well, quote unquote, destroy that person, or the same in boxing. And I didn't become more badass
Right.
in the book. So I think it's, again, people are just looking at the wrong things for evidence. They're looking at the wrong place.
They don't know. I mean, the people who say that kind of thing, the people who I heard say that in the Jeet Kune Do community, do not understand how fighting works. So they just don't know. They see somebody that looks tough. Oh, that must be the guy that's going to win. Every single one of them picked Ken Shamrock to beat Hoist. I was the only one at the time that knew Hoist would win. But they look at it like, well, look at Ken Shamrock.
Right.
Look like a carnivore, and they all pick him. Ken Shamrock's a tough guy, but at that time, Hoist would have won 10 out of 10 rounds, I think, just because of what Ken knew at the time and where MMA was. And the people who say that to you, I would be willing to bet, aren't MMA fighters and jiu-jitsu people. The people who say that stuff to you are people who either are traditional martial artists or who don't know anything about fighting.
Right. True.
And I've heard Rogan say this as well, but one of the things that training in a functional martial art for a while does is that, because like I said earlier, not only do you learn what you can do, but you learn what you can't do. And it does instill a certain amount of humility, because you can't tell what somebody knows by looking at them. Not everybody cauliflower ears, and you so it gives you a certain amount of respect for people and how you treat people, because anyone can learn how to fight.
Yeah, true. That's again a great point, where some of when you come on the, let's say, like an MMA mat or a BJJ mat, it's you can't tell like who's gonna kick your ass. Sometimes it's like that guy looks badass, and this guy's like, probably I can take him, and then 5 minutes later, the guy you thought you can take is just wiping the floor with you. So yeah. Coming a bit back to Jeet Kune Do, and I know somewhat of the story, but I think it's always great to hear that part of the story. And you mentioned a bit of the parts of it, but the question is, how did you become disillusioned with the practice? What was the main point where you realized this is the wrong place for me?
Well, I was teaching it, so and my focus never changed from wanting to learn how to fight. So I was teaching things, and then I was, I was the only one who would do sparring in class. So I was basically given Friday night to do what I wanted to do. On Friday night, at the gym I taught at, it was called Portland Martial Arts Academy. Friday nights we did basically what would be called later MMA. So we just put on whatever equipment we could and we fought. And I would, none of this trapping and all the stuff that they were doing ever came up in any way whatsoever. While at the same time I saw we have massive holes in our game. Like there was no real clinch. Nobody had a good sprawl. There was some Muay Thai clinch, but the wrestling was more or less absent, and on the ground they had no idea what to do. And so we have these huge chunks of what actually makes you need for fighting gone, and then all this inordinate amount of time spent on nonsense. And after a while I realized I just can't teach this to people. I don't believe in it. I just don't believe it anymore. That combined with spending time around the community and time around some of the instructors. I mean, I could tell you some stories about that, but I just became disillusioned with them and what I saw. I remember one of the last times, I'll tell you this kind of funny story. When I would hang out with other guys who were training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or stuff like that, and we were talking, we would generally talk about training, things that we were working on, something we'd seen the instructor do that we wanted to focus on, stuff like that. And when I would go out with these guys, the Jeet Kune Do guys, and they would sit around after a seminar and talk, 100% politics. This guy did that. This guy did that, and they're gossiping like old women. And I remember there was a Canadian instructor who'd been around Jeet Kune Do forever, and they were all talking about these other guys who were teaching something that they weren't supposed to teach, and that kind of stuff. And he said, "Well, I've been keeping files on him." And then he showed a folder, and he had files where he was putting all the stuff the guy was doing, and he kept them. And I thought to myself, that's fucking insane. And as I was thinking that and looking at it, I looked around the table, and the rest of them were like, "Oh, that's good. You're keeping files on him." And I'm like, these are not my people.
Yeah.
So it was, when you're teaching stuff that's not real, even if some of what you do is real, if you compromise on that, some of what you do is real and some of what you do is not real, you're going to attract people, different kinds of people who are not necessarily interested in the same thing. When you're teaching a functional martial art, when all you're teaching is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or MMA or whatever, the people that come and stay and gather and train and continue on are people who are interested in learning how to fight, how to do the martial art. When you compromise on that and you start teaching nonsense, you're going to also get the kind of people that I'm talking about who weren't really interested in fighting. It's more of I don't even know how to say it, a weird social ladder, their own little thing that they climb or whatever, some social hierarchy, but it had nothing to do with fighting. And I just didn't want anything to do with that. All I cared about was training. That's literally all I cared about. I didn't care about a certificate. I didn't care about any of the other stuff. So, I knew I had to do my own thing.
If I know your story well enough, the next stage, a big part of it was bringing the concept of aliveness to the martial arts world.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not certain if I know how the concept was born, or even how you coined the term.
Yeah. So I was obsessed with, like I said, what works and what doesn't work. And when you're interested in martial arts and you're obsessed with what works and what doesn't work, the questions that constantly come up that I would ask myself, especially when I was in the Jeet Kune Do community and that other people would ask, is often like style versus style, right? So when I was teaching the Jeet Kune Do concepts, I remember one day there was a big whiteboard, and I drew a ladder up the whiteboard. I called it the ladder of reality, I think. And at the bottom, I put, stuff like Silat, things like that. Up at the top, I had Muay Thai and Shuto. And what I was doing is I was ranking the arts that we taught at that academy by what I thought was functional. The next day, the guy came in and erased it for sure because that was heresy. But but that's an example of, I'm trying to, what is the difference? Why does, for example, Muay Thai work so well? And down here we'll have this, they're both doing punches. They're both doing kicks. It's not the technique. And very quickly I realized it's the training method. Just like with critical thinking, it's not the answer you come up with. It's the way you arrive at the answer that matters. You want an answer-seeking method that is reliable and that brings you back as close as possible in alignment with actuality, right? That's what you want. And so the focus was the training method. So I had that going in my mind. I had the term aliveness going in my mind, which Bruce Lee himself used. And he would compare that with dead pattern training, what he called dissecting a corpse. And I found it ironic constantly that Jeet Kune Do went back to almost 90% of what they did would be dissecting a corpse. Like the guy would throw a punch and just freeze, right? And then you do all the cool stuff. But he's not moving. Why, when people ask me a quick pointer on how can you tell me when a martial arts demonstration is bullshit and when it's not, I always tell them not to watch the feeder. Don't watch the person doing the technique. Watch the person that's feeding them. That's how you can tell if it's real or not. You see, obviously, Aikido is another great example of that.
Yeah, it's perfect for that.
But there was that, and then it was something I heard Hickson say, and Hickson was talking about jiu-jitsu, and he rolled with a room full of people. And then sat off to the side of the mat, and somebody was asking him about how he trained, and he said, jiu-jitsu is about timing. It's about knowledge of technique, yes, but it's about timing. And the reason why I can do this over and over again and they have no chance is because of the timing. And then he used an example of a triangle choke and how he would start the triangle with very tight and have the person try and escape. And then as he got better at it, he would widen it and widen it and widen it until there was more and more space. And that was the process of how he developed a triangle. So it's not repeating the triangle 100 times in the air or 100 times on a dummy or in some magical pattern, but it was against an alive resisting opponent. So what Hickson's talking about there was not sparring. Because a lot of people confuse aliveness with sparring. They'll say, yes, we need to pressure test what we do. Yeah, you do, but that's not aliveness. What Hickson's talking about is repetitions against an alive opponent, and that could be done, as you know, very softly. It could be done gently, but it's real. Because why is it real? Because it's not in a pattern, a sense of timing, and a sense of functional movement. Timing, energy, motion, right? There are basically three sides of the same thing, which is aliveness. There's three different ways to look at the same thing. But for something to be fully alive, you have to have all three. And it's when I realized that, I realized that is the answer to why some arts work and some arts don't. 100%, it's aliveness. And to go back to Systema for a moment, one of the reasons why I think Systema is enticing for a person is they have two of the aspects of aliveness, but it's still not alive because they're missing one. Right. So the first thing they have is it's not in a pattern generally, because they just make it up as they go. You can see that as they're moving. So there's a sense of timing, and there is a sense of motion. There's a consistent motion. They're not like flat-footed the way you often see with make-believe martial arts. What's missing is functional energy. Nobody's ever going to throw a punch that slow while the other guy does this, But as soon as you take one of those pieces out, whether it's timing, energy, or motion, then you're no longer dealing with something that's alive, and you can make up a fake martial art.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never thought about that Systema. It's a great point, like why people believe it, because it does have some elements, but it doesn't have the full picture, and it doesn't work without one of the parts. There's this question which sometimes comes up. I thought about it, and it comes up online sometimes. I almost think like the answer is obvious, but it's interesting to look at it. So if BJJ would remove rolling, would you say that in a few years it would become like all fantasy-based martial arts?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you add something?
Yeah, so rolling and alive drills, so both. But if you remove aliveness from it, if the way you taught Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was solely in a pattern, if we came up with a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu katas, and you would grab the other person, and the other person feeds you a particular movement, like feed you a triangle, and then you like they call them sensitivity drills or flow drills in Jeet Kune Do concepts, where you'd have these patterns of doing things to each other, like swinging a stick, or they would take something really good like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and they would make it stupid by turning it into a ridiculous pattern, taking the aliveness out. But that you could do that. I could be mount, you upa, I roll, I get guard, I scissor sweep, I take mount, you upa, I roll, I get guard, scissor sweep. And you and I could practice that. We could make it look really cool. It'll look really good at a demonstration at a tournament, whatever, but you and I could do that for 10 years and we're still not going to get very good at the scissor sweep or the upa or the triangle. And that's what would happen the moment you took aliveness out of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I really don't think it would take long. It would be less than a generation and the art would be lost. Right. And you could see, I think that's what happened with Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, just for cultural reasons. Judo maintained aliveness because it was a sport. And so they had to use a functional method because in sports they care about winning. So meritocracy still matters. But the moment you take that goal of winning out, competition out of it, and it no longer becomes a combat sport, and then you lay on top of that a cultural incentive not to fight. How long did it take before Japanese Jiu-Jitsu although it incorporates many of the same movements, the same arm bars, the same techniques that you'll find in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You and I both know that a Japanese Jiu-Jitsu black belt who's not done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is probably going to get killed by a blue belt or maybe even a 4-stripe white belt on the mat.
Yeah.
That's how quickly the whole thing devolves.
For sure. Yeah, I'm actually in a bit of a war situation, not as bad as I was sometimes in, but with, have you heard about Bujinkan? A practice named Bujinkan? It's like ninja stuff, like ninjutsu.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And,
Like
yeah, right.
Hatsumi guy?
Yeah, that one. You know, the pink hair and everything. So I made a video dissecting some of the videos, and obviously, you know, people don't like that. Some people don't. But then I looked at it again, and a lot of their footage is they do techniques like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, and I think some schools they do pressure testing. So I can't say about everyone, but I think they take a lot of the techniques which do work. So let's say some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu sweeps or submissions, but they train it without aliveness, basically, without any resistance or move motion energy. And I can just see, you know, it's a bit of a bold statement in one way, but I can see like myself being a blue belt. Yeah, probably I would have a very easy time with them, even like if they perform that technique very quickly, but then they don't have those other elements and it just becomes worthless.
Yep.
Yeah, and also we spoke about this quite a while ago, but I think it's an interesting moment to revisit. So the desire to make a martial art functional.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been through that. I'm playing with some stuff right now, but it's mostly just for the sake of the internet because people are interested in it. But some time ago, I was more invested in it as, okay, I realized my Aikido doesn't work. It's time to make it functional. I think a lot of people, that's kind of the in-between stage of letting go of that relationship. But so just looking at it generally, the desire to functionalize a martial art which is not effective. What's your personal take on it?
Yeah, so that's a trap, as we talked about that before.
Right.
I don't know how much time we have, but I'll tell you a funny story that
please.
It goes back to Aikido. So long time ago, when I think I was a blue belt or maybe a purple belt, so this would have been in the 90s or mid, I was friends with an Aikido instructor. He was an Aikido black belt. He'd been doing Aikido for a long time, kind of believed it worked. And you know, I didn't want to humiliate him, didn't want to beat him up or anything, but I was trying to get him from not wasting his time. And so he finally agreed that we would come down to the gym and we would test stuff out. Now he was about, I went to his school. Now he was about probably 190 pounds, and I was at the time probably 220. So I brought along with me another student of mine named Greg, who's a $125 at best. He was very skinny, small guy, a blue belt, and had only been doing jiu-jitsu, I think, at that time for probably 3 years, maybe 2 years. And the Aikido guy had been doing it forever. You can predict what happened, right? So I rolled him gently a little bit, but then there's always, well, you know, you outweigh me by 50 pounds. You've been doing it. Yeah, okay. Here's my friend Greg. He's been training for 30 months. And Greg, being less gentle with him than I was, just like wiped the floor over and over again. And he went through it's almost like there's stages of grief. He went through the typical stages that you would go through. So at first it was, well, Aikido works. And then it's like, well, I'm just doing it wrong, or it must. And eventually he had to concede, okay, Aikido doesn't work. Right? You have to concede that. And then it becomes, okay, maybe it doesn't work, but it's useful, right? You know, people are learning to be humble and respectful and all these other things. And my question to him in that case was, well, what is it that you think you would get from an Aikido training session, mindful that Aikido doesn't work, but it is somehow useful for spiritual or self-actualization reasons, that you could not get from a functional martial art? What is it you think you're going to get there in that dojo that you wouldn't get on the mat? And then I would explain to him how much more powerful it is when you actually have to tap out, right? So like the reason why Greg could do to you what he did is because he's tapped out himself hundreds of times. He's had to admit defeat in just about every training session for the last 3 years. And when do you ever have to admit defeat in the school? Which one do you think it teaches more lessons for the ego? So then he dropped that one. So it's always first it works, and then, okay, it doesn't work, but it's useful. And then when he dropped the it's useful one, then basically what's left is attack the messenger, which is, well, you guys are just jocks and we're not this. But that didn't work in our case because he knew me and he knew Greg. And I'm like, you come down to the gym, everybody's going to be nice to you. They're going to shake your hand. Yeah. There's a lot less ego on my mat than I will ever find in your lobby filled with Birkenstocks when I come to an Aikido class, you know? And so he had to concede that ultimately. And then it was very shortly after that, he called me up maybe a week later, and he was on a mission to save Aikido. We've got to save Aikido. We got to functionalize Aikido. I got to tell this stuff to people. And the thing there is, okay, when you're done with saving Aikido, how do you think it's going to be different from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Standing, how will it be different from Judo or Greco-Roman? On the ground, how will it be different from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or catch wrestling or any other functional grappling art? Because ultimately what's going to happen is you're just going to wind up reinventing the wheel. I don't have enough in my lifetime to even scratch the surface of the fundamentals of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yeah. I also teach clinch and stand-up. I don't have enough in my lifetime to scratch the surface of one kind of style of boxing, let alone all the different aspects of and nuances of boxing and kickboxing. Greco-Roman, Judo, you could spend a lifetime just learning Greco-Roman. These are functional martial arts, and we're gifted with the fact that there's literally thousands of masters, for lack of a better term, wrestling coaches, judo black belts, boxing coaches. My boxing coach at the time was in his 80s, been boxing since the 20s at that time. These guys are everywhere. Why would I not spend my time listening to what they have to say and absorbing what they have to say from an empty cup? Like, in all seriousness, what's going to be left when you're done with Aikido that would make it look any different from MMA? And I think he thought about that for a while, and he realized, yeah, you know, I'm going to wind up doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and calling it Aikido. Yeah. So sometimes I think it's just better to just let stuff go. Just gotta let it go, you know?
Yeah. It's actually one of my favorite stories that I like to tell from time to time of my first conversation with you, which was on record. I still, up till this day, I like to say it's like the most significant, best conversation I ever had, because you really knew what I was going through, and you had all the right answers. But there was that moment where beforehand, everyone I interviewed, I was still functionalizing Aikido, and I would ask all these people like Roy Dean, who used to be Aikido black belt, now BJJ black belt, and some other people. I was like, so what's your advice for me? And usually they would say, well, you should do some boxing and add a little bit of BJJ, and they would try to kind of give a solution. And you just said, I think you should quit Aikido. Yeah. I didn't see that coming, but then you justified it, and you mentioned that life is short and you can't. There's already a limited amount of energy we can invest, so let's invest it to the best possible place. And for me, that concept of life is short was always significant. So just opened up my mind, and that eventually led me to this great journey. I also remembered while you were sharing your story, I actually had a brief talk with John Will the other day, and he said that he had, I think, like 6 Aikido black belts over the years coming to train with him. They initially all wanted to add BJJ to their Aikido. Yeah. All of them eventually completely dropped Aikido. Yeah. And it's funny too that I think, and it's something I just realized lately, I don't know even a single individual who changed from. I don't like using the term traditional martial arts, but it's at the moment it's like there's fantasy-based martial arts, but that's, for some people, it's even more confusing to understand if they're doing it or not. Yeah. But then I don't know a person, let's say, who went from traditional martial arts to combat sports that they would regret it. I don't know even one, and there's like thousands of people that I got a chance to interact with. So is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I've never met anyone that regretted
Oh, did I lose you? Okay, I think I lost Matt. Am I online, everyone? Did I freeze, or is it Matt? This.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, there we go. Are you back? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
So, do you remember where you were cut off?
Yeah. So if we talk about time again, most of us have families, we have jobs. Assume that you're not single and your only thing that you care about or do in your life is martial arts. There's not many people like that, right? You're not a professional fighter, let's say. Most of us only have 2 or 3 days a week that we can train, maybe 4 if you're lucky. And if you're training in an actual functional martial art, there's only so much your body can do, right? Because we're training like athletes. We're not just standing around clicking sticks together, rolling. You're moving. It's tough on the body. There's only so much you can do before your body goes out of an anabolic state. So when you really break that down, most of us really only have 6 to 8 hours at most a week that we can really train. And more often, actually, for most people, it's probably less, right? They have maybe 4 to 6 hours a week that they can train. What do you want to spend that time on? I mean, if you really love the other stuff, then that's fine, as long as you're honest about it and you're not misleading people. I've never had a problem with that. I rarely ever see that. I've never walked into an Aikido school that had a sign on the door that said, what we do is not functional, but or whatever. We're a cultural affectation. But yeah, all of us have only a really limited amount of time to train, myself included, and I do this for a living. So I want to maximize that time doing what I love, which is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and functional martial arts. I cannot imagine wasting my time with something that's not going to work. Like, I'm never going to get that time back.
I think that's very powerful and true. That also partly answers what I was about to ask, but I'm still interested to discuss that quickly. So I mentioned that, and you might have seen, I did a couple of videos where I tried pressure testing some of my old Aikido techniques. One thing which is interesting and that my local BJJ coach made that good point, that a person who's very good at combat sports can make things work, which others won't, and it doesn't necessarily make a technique much better.
Right.
But that whole exploration, it still kind of brought that question of, okay, so some Aikido movements, if they're pressure tested, like some wrist locks, they could maybe be made functional. But at the same time, it's not going to be Aikido anymore. It's just Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu adding this wrist lock. But in a way, it's like, oh, we're adding something new. So a lot of people, I think, can find it very cool. It's like, oh, this is like, people are hyped and excited, and they're like, oh, this is like a discovery of a new martial art. Although I think most BJJ guys already try that out sometime. But at the same time, so one side of it is like, oh, maybe we can add something new. But the other side is, I think that comes to the debate and a question I wanted to bring up as well. BJJ can sometimes, in my opinion, be guilty already of coming up with all these new moves and chasing the next new thing. And I think we spoke already about that. That's like, probably we're both not big fans of that. And it almost seems like bringing functional techniques from other martial arts, it's almost like the same. So what's your opinion about the whole thing?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I realize we're live, but can I run to the bathroom real quick?
Oh yeah, please do. So I'm just answer some of the questions while you go.
Too much coffee, but I'll be right back.
Yeah, you're good. You're good. So yes, everyone. While Matt is away for a moment, just use this. Let's use this chance to discuss whatever's on your mind. I did see Pablo. I saw your question. I'm definitely going to ask that to Matt. So let me see. Who I know there's a bit of a lag. Like, that's the reason I'm just talking about nothing right now, because it's going to take a few seconds until I see your comments from what I said. Okay, so someone is writing Grokus. Now, Thornton, it's also delusional if you think you just practice BJJ twice a week makes you a fighter. That's an interesting take. I guess, and we can, when we open up for Q&A, we can ask Matt about that as well. I'd say, yeah, in a way it's delusional because, first of all, BJJ is not entirely fighting. And again, I'm talking just about my opinion, especially if there are no strikes involved. If you're just doing BJJ or competition BJJ, I think you'll be better at fighting, but it also depends on how do we define a fighter. But for me, a fighter is, yes, a person who's able to fight on all levels, kind of more of a mixed martial artist. So training twice just BJJ, I guess you're right. I guess it would make you into a fighter. So I was just keeping people entertained, but we can get back to your point. Yeah.
What you're talking about, I'll give you two things to think about there. So the first one is, if you're good at jiu-jitsu, I think this is my 21st year as a black belt. I've been doing jiu-jitsu for 30 years. If somebody comes in, even if they're big, unless they're relatively skilled at Brazilian jiu-jitsu, I can probably do any kind of lock I want to them. You could show me something from Aikido or Kung Fu or something, and I could probably pull it off. But what is that proof of? That's just proof of when you get good enough at a particular delivery system, you can make just about anything work. And that's the exceptions that prove the rule. That doesn't mean that those arts are functional. That means I'm so good at a particular range that I can pull it off. Let's use Conor McGregor as an example. He could, against your average human, probably do any kind of strike he wanted. You could, like, the most ridiculous Kung Fu strike. It wouldn't surprise me if he could set it up and knock the person out. But that's not evidence for that being an efficient functional martial art. That's evidence for how good Conor is at standing. So what that gets back to, rather than talking about styles, and we mentioned this earlier before, but talking about delivery systems, when I first started teaching and talking about functional martial arts, the first message I put out there for about the first 10 years was aliveness. That's the point I wanted to get across to everybody. And then after that, I started talking more about drilling, how you train aliveness, because I found that we were training too rough, but also a lot of people have misinterpreted what I was talking about to mean sparring. And so I wanted to talk about how you drill, eye method, all how we break it down so that anybody can train with aliveness. That was really the second big message, was aliveness is for everybody, no matter how old or young. And then the last 10 years or so, the main message we've been getting across is the message of fundamentals. Like, what defines somebody as good in stand-up clinch or ground isn't how many techniques they know or anything like that. It's their skill in the fundamentals that drive the delivery system. And in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of course, that's your positional control. Same thing in the clinch. And with stand-up, it's things like your main ability to maintain distance, your mechanics. Those are the things that define somebody as being good. So what we try and spend our time on at SBG are the fundamentals of the delivery system. And as each athlete, student grows through those fundamentals, and they start to get good, then they will have all kinds of idiosyncratic movements that are kind of unique to them. Everybody will have their own style, their own way of moving. People will do things. That doesn't mean other people should imitate it. That's just their own unique way of expressing themselves. And that's kind of the process for functional martial arts. You learn the fundamentals, and then by applying the fundamentals in live circumstances over and over and over again, you start to develop your own style, your own way of expressing those fundamentals, which for every Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt is going to be different. For every MMA fighter, it's going to be different. How many fighters fight like Conor, right, with that in and out range and everything else? Most fighters shouldn't even imitate that. That's how he fights. So the process to become like that is to focus on fundamentals, and then over time you learn how your body best expresses those movements. So again, it's not about the techniques. It's about training with aliveness in the fundamentals of the delivery system, and then you will develop all kinds of little movements and things that are kind of unique and cool to you, but that's not what makes you good. What makes Connor good and be able to do what he does is that he's so gifted at those fundamentals. People lose sight of that because unless you're also a combat athlete coach or a fighter yourself, you may not see that. You see the flashy stuff, you see the cool stuff that catches your eye, but underlying, that fighting skill is just like this unbelievable sense of distance and timing and accuracy that's taken years of training to develop.
Yeah, I sometimes think, when I think about fundamentals, I think about boxing, and it's not entirely true, but I like that idea that boxing has 6 strikes, or
Yep.
more or less, and people work their whole lives just doing those strikes. And recently I started training and sparring with a world champion kickboxer, and obviously he knows a lot of tricks and everything, but he's still using the jab is the jab, the cross is the cross, the hook is the hook, but he does it in the whole timing and the way he sets it up and everything is just like there's no way I could do anything to him. So
right.
And speaking of fundamentals, also one thing which impressed me, and this is what I learned from you, I think when you spoke about Rickson, that he would take fundamentals and he would take techniques which a lot of BJJ people would abandon somewhere down the road as, oh, this is like a basic technique. Like, and also a thing I learned from you, that there's a difference between basic and fundamental. But then he would take those techniques which people would learn on first few months of their BJJ journey, and he would submit high-level black belts with them. So that was really impressive for me, and that kind of makes me gravitate as well to just why train so many different things when you can just train the things which really matter. And so could you just, so people would understand better the importance of fundamentals, could you say a few more words about how you perceive fundamentals?
Yeah. So what I like to say is there's no such thing as beginning, intermediate, or...
Okay, I think we lost Matt for a moment again. Yeah, well, everyone stay calm. Same applies to me. Let's wait it out. Let's wait a few seconds. I think it's probably Matt, right? Yeah, Matt froze again. Let's give a few seconds. He came back once. I'm sure he'll be back, and we'll open up for questions in a moment. So we're almost there. So Nathaniel Chalkin, I can read his comment in the meantime. We're in good connection. So Aikido structurally offense, defense, self-defense, weapons, multiple attack drills. We'll leave the philosophy to the side for now. Why not MMA partner forms with offense, defense, drills? Well, that's a question. Okay, Matt dropped entirely. I'm pretty sure she's going to come back in a moment. So, but let me sure I keep you entertained. So anyone has questions for me? I give you a few seconds to think about it, and I'll maybe look for something. So let's say Kadmaru Unknown. Brokas, can you please name some martial art except MMA, BJJ, Muay Thai, and boxing that works? Kickboxing? Okay, Matt is back. Are you okay, Matt?
Yeah, all good.
Okay.
So, fundamentals are not what's most basic, but what's most important. And here's a great example of that, of somebody who truly has mastered the fundamentals of jiu-jitsu. So I think that's true of all the delivery systems, stand-up, clinch, and ground. Everybody I've met and who's been a true master of a particular delivery system is a master of the fundamentals of that delivery system. And so personally as a coach, that's all I like to teach. I think you actually restrict people's creativity and progress the more you veer away from fundamentals and start teaching individual style. Like I'll explain to my students, what I do on the mat is irrelevant to you or anybody else. I'm going to teach the fundamentals, and you're going to learn how you apply it on the mat yourself. And then when they become black belts and teach, at least they're going to teach the SBG way, I would like to think that they'll do the same thing. They'll impart the fundamentals to the student and then let the student develop their own way of making it work through a live training. And with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, people understand that there's a very specific thing that we're looking for, that Rickson is looking for. and that's efficiency. We're looking for the most efficient way to do something. And efficiency is defined as using as little as possible, but no less. As little as possible strength, as little as possible energy, as little as possible explosiveness, as little as possible risk. And in the beginning, you're going to have to use a lot more of those because you don't have that much skill in the fundamentals. And as you get better and better at the fundamentals, you can use less and less of those attributes. And there are more efficient ways to perform movements. There's a more efficient way to cut off the blood supply to somebody's head, and then there's less efficient ways to do it. And what we're looking for constantly in SBG is the most efficient way to do those things. And the most efficient way that we know at a given time is the fundamental. That's the fundamental. That's the way we want to teach it and pass it on to the students. And Hickson is his game and his just everything about him personifies, I think, that ethos.
So I'll open up the Q&A just in a moment, but right before that, I also wanted to use this as a moment for a plug, and so we were speaking about fundamentals, and SBG and your teachings is, you could say, like we'd say all about that. So I wanted to bring up SBG University, and maybe you can say a few words about that.
Yeah, thank you, Rokas. I actually got my SBG University shirt on.
Indeed.
So I put out videos. My first set of videos on Aliveness, I think, came out in like '98. But these days, of course, everybody's going online and working online, and I teach so much that, and for the last 20 years, I've been traveling all over the world to teach in person to different groups, and I still enjoy doing that at the different gyms, but it logically, anyone now from around the world can come and take classes with me and watch what I'm doing in my Portland gym. So that's what SBG University is for. We have instructional sets that go up, instructional clips that go up about the most efficient way to do particular things, how to train, how to drill. And they can just watch my weekly classes go up and follow along. And then, of course, they have access to ask questions and things like that. So I'd encourage anybody that's interested in what we do to check it out. That's the platform where I try and put everything.
Nice. Yeah, and I'm obviously a bit biased because I'm involved in it, but also truthfully, I really like when I look for the videos, like the videos you teach, like that's, or the way you teach, like that's like, I miss that. Like that's one of the reasons why I have a hard time going to BJJ classes here locally, because it's a lot about just teaching the technique versus what it's about, how it works, what's the essence of it. And when I was in Portland, I was going to your classes, I was just loving it because it was all about the essence, the fundamentals of it versus, oh, let's learn this technique today and that technique next time. And I think SBG University is a great place to get that essential part. So I highly recommend it to everyone. So, okay, I'm backtracking to see one of the questions, and that's actually a moment to let everyone know that we are ready to get them. I wonder if, okay, so there's one question I promised that we'll answer from Pablo, but Pablo, that question I think it got lost in, I only see like a part of the question, so please, if you could repeat that question, I'll make sure to bring it up. Otherwise, we're good to go for new ones. Sorry, Matt, this is a technical difficulty for me. I'm about to bring up a question on the monitor. Okay, and it takes a few seconds for people to bring them up. Cool. Okay, so, well, that's kind of a bit of a weird question, but let's start here. So do you think it is a martial art if there isn't knife defense?
Do you think it is a martial art if there isn't knife defense? Well, do I think wrestling's a martial art? Do I think judo's a martial art? Yeah. So do I think it's a complete martial art if you're not also training weapons? I think if you want to be a complete martial artist, you should train stand-up, clinch, and ground and weapons. And these days that means primarily firearms, but also edged and impact weapons. We do all that at SBG. So we take the same process that we do for everything else, for the most functional, efficient ways to do these things, even with the firearms. And we've got some world-class coaches and people in SBG with firearms, like Andy Stump and Paul Sharp and Ray Price and these guys. And Carl Tanswell, the late Carl Tanswell from the UK years ago, actually, I think the second time I met him, showed me what he'd come up with to defend against knives after he'd been attacked. He was stabbed at times while he was working on a door. He lived only because his fiance at the time was a nurse, and she was able to stop the bleeding. But after that, he threw away. He'd come from a very similar background to me, almost identical in terms of concepts of Filipino martial arts. And he threw all that away and just started from scratch to look for a way that he could survive. You know, if you find yourself in that situation, obviously you don't ever want to have to defend against a knife. They're incredibly dangerous. But what if you have to, for some particular reason, like he was, you're cornered and somebody just is trying to stick you? And he did. He came up with something that is, I think, the best thing I've ever seen up to that point. I think it still is the best thing, and that's that program we use to defend against knives in SBG.
Nice. Well, speaking of self-defense, Tim M is asking, what training methods are best for self-defense?
Yeah, so I have a book. So I just actually signed weeks ago with a publisher, and that book is just on violence, and in particular, violence as it relates to personal self-defense. So, and it's probably going to be 2 volumes. But the first volume that's coming out is all the non-physical parts of self-defense that you need to know. And there's a lot, but anyone can learn it. Much of it is common sense, but not all of it. And people to think that because what we do physically is the best, that our pre-fight or non-physical training isn't also the best. We take the same approach to self-defense as we do to combat sports. So all that information there, the kind of things that teach my own kids, it's the kind of thing that I show to stay. Now, having said that, if it fails, and for some reason having a physical, I have skill in stand-up clinching, in the fighting, and unless you're a police officer, you're protecting somebody else. In most cases, hopefully, you can just run away. Right? Advocating for anybody to around and exchange with somebody in a street fight. You want to try and run away. If you can't run away, why can't you run away? You can't run away. It's onto you. Grab you, they've tackled you around. When somebody puts their arm on you, it's grabbing you, throwing you down, or trying to hang on to you, they're in the world grapplers. Now in our pool. So every moment of time you spend on the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu mat or the wrestling mat come into play, and be what will save you in those kind of situations. So for most people, having said all that, my long way of saying, for most people, I would want you to learn the fundamentals of staying safe, using your brain, maturity, intelligence, noticing what's going around you, not being selected by predators because of behaviors that you have. And once you have all that, I'd want you to focus on a combat sport. And for most people, unless they have a particularly dangerous job, I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is enough.
Cool. So Nathaniel Chalkin is bringing up a question, and I think I'll elaborate a bit on that. But doesn't it seem like the self-defense techniques from BJJ should have aliveness drills? And I think I presume that Nathaniel is referring to, well, I can, I guess, put it on record, Gracie self-defense. At least when I look at it, and that's a question that comes from me as well, or some of the jiu-jitsu self-defense courses, not SBG by any means, but what I see online, BJJ is drilling, aliveness, and everything, and then self-defense, it's dead patterns. Did you come to see that as well?
Yeah. So in answer to Nathaniel's question, absolutely. Of course it should. That's how we apply it. It depends really on school to school, but I know what he's talking about. In fairness to Youre and Tanner, I do think that they do advocate a live drill. So they'll show the movements, and then they have a different term for it. But they'll have like pressure testing drills that they do, and I like a lot of what they do. But there's a more traditional, for lack of a better term, branch of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu where when they do the self-defense stuff, like a defense against a knife or somebody grabbing you, that kind of thing, it becomes very much a dead pattern, and it's very much like 1 and 2 step sparring that you see. And yeah, that's not the approach I would take. I think there are valuable movements in much of that self-defense material, but it always has to be trained alive.
So Bob was asking something, and I quickly just wanted to make a note. Beforehand, this was made into a sponsored comment, which I always like to appreciate and thank you for. So Pablo's question is, what does Matt think about Rickson's Jiu-Jitsu Global Federation, and what does he think about the future of Jiu-Jitsu in a community that seems to be more interested in the sportive side of the art?
Yeah, so I'm part of Rickson's organization, proudly so. I think that Jiu-Jitsu has grown to such an extent that there's going to be schools that, well, it's already this way, but there's going to be schools that focus primarily on IJJF rules and train for that. There's going to be schools that focus primarily on the EBI, no-gi rules, the Eddie Bravo invitational rules, and train that way. And there's going to be some schools that focus on all the above, and a few that maybe focus more on subset aspects of it. I made a decision in terms of teaching jiu-jitsu that I wasn't going to compromise my jiu-jitsu training for fighting in any way to accommodate tournaments. So the jiu-jitsu I teach in Portland is fundamental jiu-jitsu that's designed to work fighting. And I have an MMA comp team, and I have students that compete in IBJJF, and I have students that compete in the EBI rules, and they do well. But I do not cater my curriculum towards those rule sets. So for me personally, and for SPG as a whole, I want to continue teaching jiu-jitsu for fighting. That's the jiu-jitsu that I love. That's the jiu-jitsu I fell in love with, Vale Tudo, as we used to say in the 90s. And I think that I think we've proven that you can do that, have students that'll do very well. IBJJF, win world championships. We'll have students that'll get that. So I don't think you have to just choose this or that. That's definitely where we're at. These schools that come one or the other more than free to choose and go. If their prime focus is IBJJF, then there'll be places they can go for that.
So Matt, before I ask the next question, I think there's a bit of a low connection from your end. Is it possible, and is there anything you think that could be done to improve it at the moment?
Yeah, give me 1 second. Let me open the door real quick and see if anything's got moved.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, this is taking a bit longer than I expected. I'm sure we'll be back in a moment, though. Okay, let me see if I can find and dig out a question which is for me while we're waiting for Matt to get back. Okay, so Cudmore Unknown is asking what are my thoughts about Jeff Thompson's self-defense method. I didn't dig into it very deeply, but I like it. What I saw, I liked quite a bit. I like the defense. I like his psychological approach. I did train and meet multiple times with his close friend, Peter Constantine, who helped as well with the self-defense method. And I really have huge admiration for him. And he knows the whole picture, speaking of Peter Constantine, because he is not only, he was a bouncer, and he was also he also has a security company, which we talked about, that it's a completely different game than bouncing on the door, fighting people on the street. So yeah, I admire them both, and I think they're doing a great job. Looks like it's better. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, hopefully that I can try and set up a hotspot too here if we need to. Let me know if it goes bad.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's better. It was quite bad at the moment, so I think we're good. So another sponsored comment question, which I appreciate. Thank you. So it's a question that I just started BJJ 2 weeks ago. I'm 43 years old and started to develop some lower back pain. Any advice to help reduce the pain, please? And thank you.
Yeah. I'd want to ask more questions, but I'm gonna circumvent that whole process to cut to the chase here. If you just started 2 weeks ago and you're 43, all I care about is that you stay on the mat. I don't want you to quit. So if you stay on the mat, you're going to be a black belt in your 50s, and that's awesome. What kills people in the beginning, the first year they do jiu-jitsu, they fall in love with it and they train too often. And then your body starts to break down, especially in your 40s. So what I would say is right now, restrict yourself to at least, at most, 3 days a week. Maybe even think about just doing 2 days a week for a while, but don't be training every night or 5 nights a week. You know, make it like maybe 2 weeknights and 1 day on the weekend or something like that. Keep your rolling down to 40 minutes to an hour at each time at most, and make sure, you know, you warm up really well and you cool down afterwards. So common sense stuff, but very often I see people start jiu-jitsu, they love it, they're going 4, 5, 6 days a week, and that lasts for about 2 months, and then they're broken, or they're too sore, and then then it's no longer restricting it 2 or 3 days a week so they feel good. It's restricting it 2 or 3 days a week because they have to. So I would say, you know, don't make that mistake. Play the long game. Think of this as you're going to be on the mat for the rest of your life, like I am. I'm going to be on the mat when I'm in my 90s. So roll accordingly, right? Pick your roles, roll with smart people, and don't overtrain right now. Just take it easy in the beginning.
Nice. A question about Jeet Kune Do, and we somewhat covered that, but Bruce Lee wrote extensively about aliveness and sparring and training. Do you have any ideas on the progression where that stopped being focused on in JKD?
Yeah, so there's a couple camps there, right? So you have the original Jeet Kune Do guys, and you have the Jeet Kune Do Concept School. In Jeet Kune Do Concept School, obviously Dan Inosanto took over after Bruce Lee died. And from what I could tell, a lot of what they did at the Kali Academy was pretty functional. They had some really good kickboxing. I like a lot of the Jun Fong kickboxing, the Bruce Lee material. He had Muay Thai in there, things like that. I just think that, in particular, he really loves martial arts. He loves all kinds of martial arts and loves Southeast Asian martial arts. His heritage is Filipino, and he likes the Filipino martial arts and silat, pencak silat, and those kind of things. And so that was immediately brought in. And I think that's part of the problem. Long story short, I think when you start bringing in arts like that, you have to take aliveness out, because when you put aliveness in, it doesn't work. So the Dog Brothers, when they started to apply aliveness and functional strength to Filipino martial arts, you'll notice it gets really pared down. Back to what fundamentals, footwork, power, certain things have become very important, combined with heavy emphasis on being able to fight on the ground, because once you hit someone with a stick once or twice, they're going to tackle you and fight on the ground. Nobody's going to stand there and exchange blows with a stick. And so all of a sudden now the curriculum turns to really good footwork, being able to hit with power, and then being able to clinch and fight on the ground. And I the amount of time that we've had that been discussed early, and then the curriculum flowed from that. So form follows function, the other way around with my preference. So happens when we spar. This is how we're going to train so that our people can be the best stick fighters in the world. When that motivation is taken out and it becomes instead we're going to learn an art, that's okay. But now you're no longer following the same path. It's not about fighting. Now it's about learning and accumulating this cultural information. And there's all kinds of room for exploitation in those kind of circumstances because the self-correcting mechanism of functional feedback is taken away. And if you're not careful, like I said before, like we've been talking about this whole time, that really quickly devolves into dead patterns, which is exactly what Bruce Lee talked about.
So another question, which is how important are physical attributes for MMA?
Well, they're important. Physical attributes are important for all fighting. I will say this. I think some people, times when I talked about, in particular, jiu-jitsu and the need to try and train relaxed and not use muscle and things like that, people misinterpret that as me saying, or other coaches who talk about that, saying that those things don't matter. It doesn't matter if you're strong. It doesn't matter if you're young. Exact opposite of that. It 100% matters if you're very strong and if you're a lot younger and if you're in great shape. Fighting is a physical activity, right? But because it matters so much, that's why we want to train when we're in the gym. We don't want to use it as much, right? When we're in the gym, we want to try and learn to overcome superior size, strength, and youth with more efficient technique. And if you get in a fight, or you're going to get in a cage, or you go into a tournament to get a gold medal, you use everything. You use all your attributes and all the skill that you developed in the delivery system. But in the gym, if you're smart, you will shelf those attributes and focus more on skill in the delivery system. And so they're both important. But when you're training, the more relaxed you are and the less you learn to rely on strength, and instead of forcing your way out of a particular submission because you're stronger than the other person or you can muscle it, you tap. And you say to yourself, how did I find myself in that position? And you grab that person again and you go through it until you're able to use technique and movement to avoid getting put in that. Now your jiu-jitsu learning curve is like this instead of like this. And so when I talk about the importance of non-attribute based training, I'm not demeaning the role of attributes. I'm talking about the reason why we want to do non-attribute based training is because attributes really matter. It really matters in a fight. So if you want to learn to overcome that, like Hickson said, strong guys grow on trees. There's strong guys everywhere. And none of us are getting younger. We're all getting older. So if you really want to overcome that, then you really have to focus on efficient technique. Having said all that, stay in shape. And if you're going to fight, of course, if you're going to be a professional fighter, athleticism, just like any other professional athlete, you have to put that at the top of the list.
Another question, which is, I think, very relevant for today's time. So do you feel that BJJ can be learned at home? I feel it is better than not training. Would like to hear your thoughts and advice.
100%, provided you have a training partner. So I don't think BJJ can be learned with a grappling dummy. I'm not a fan of grappling dummies. I don't think you can learn it yourself. You can't learn it. You can do movement exercises and things like that on the mat, but to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you have to have another body so you can train with aliveness. But if you have another body and you understand how to drill and you have access to the right material online, I 100% feel like you can get good training at home. I think one of the bigger misconceptions people have about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or fighting in general is that they need to have super tough training partners. And I think the super tough training partners is a very, very distant second or third to intelligent training. And when you're forced to train intelligently and put thought and care into what you're doing, you will grow faster than you would in a gym filled with killers who are smashing all the time. And I've seen this time and time again. I've had students, for example, Travis Davison, who's one of my black belts and the VP for SPG, moved to Montana, just a different state, 10 hours away from me, when he was a purple belt. And there was nobody in Montana at that time in that area that could beat him. So he began teaching and accumulating students for the first few years. He was better than all his students. But he learned more and I think grew faster from round to back as in a real way, in a measurable, tangible, functional way, than I think he probably would have at my gym. Because he's teaching, he's having to put thought and care into what he's doing, he's drilling. Even though everybody he was working with is a white belt, he still got very good and became legit black belt. And Hodge Gracie's another example I would use. At the peak of his career, I believe he was living in London. I don't think any in London at the time or probably now has a chance of tapping Hodge Gracie out. I think the majority of his training partners were people that he could dominate and tap 99% of the time. But if you watch Hodger train, he does what Hickson advocates. He's very smart. He puts himself in bad positions and then works his way out over and over again. And so if you have that kind of intelligent approach and you have another body, girlfriend, wife, boyfriend, whatever, friend, I think, yes, you can definitely get good at home.
Cool. I'm glad to hear you are not a fan of grappling dummies, because I'm a bit skeptical about them. So, so good to hear we're on the same page. Louis Perret is asking, would JKD have become more useful, practical if Bruce Lee hadn't died so young? He didn't have time to do trial and error.
Yeah. Kind of impossible for us to say.
Sure.
Giving him the credit from what I read from his notes, and I would think so. I mean, I would think that it seems to me that he was motivated by the same thing I'm motivated by. That all he seemed to care about is what works in a fight. He wasn't interested in preserving any particular type of tradition or accumulating patterns. He wanted to know what works and what doesn't work. I think that's pretty evident from his notes. And so I think he, in his case, form would have followed function, and he would have continued developing the art. And I have no doubt the moment he'd run across Brazilians and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and that stuff, he would have incorporated it. You can see remnants of that in Enter the Dragon when he has that ground fighting and does the armbar and stuff. And he had very limited access to grappling, but he did have some with, I think, some judo people, and then, of course, judo Bell. And look at his notebook. There's copious notes on grappling, standing grappling, and grappling on the ground. So I think he understood that. I think he would have kept growing.
I'll be wrapping up the conversation in a moment, but at least one or two last questions, and I think this is a pretty good one. So Eric is asking, what makes a good teacher? What makes a good student?
It's a good question. Both things, of course, in both cases. You know, obviously, to answer that question, I have to pare it down to one or two that I think are the most important. The teaching, I think the most important thing is that you care about teaching, that you care about being a good teacher. So very often I think people make the mistake of thinking that because somebody is good at something that they can teach it. I've talked about this before, but I've had the privilege of learning from all kinds of different instructors. Some of the worst, actually I would say the worst coaches and teachers I've run across have been world champions. It's not necessarily their fault, but that's just not what they do. You know, they're very, very good at what they do. Much of what they do is often intuitive. They've been focused. Professional athletics in combat sports is by its very nature a very selfish thing. You have to kind of focus on yourself and your diet, your own thing, to be a good MMA fighter, to be a world champion, black belt, whatever. And so they've spent so much time on themselves and usually very little time on teaching, passing along the information to other people. And by contrast, I've seen other people who are world champions did have that kind of background, but they have spent so much time thinking about how to get information to other people in a functional way because they legitimately care about doing that. And they become great coaches, great instructors, and will produce world champions, and they'll produce other people that will come out of their school. But more importantly than that, anyone that takes their class will learn. It won't just be good athletes or people who have a knack for jiu-jitsu. You can have a room full of students of all kinds of different levels. Many of them struggle normally to learn the art. And
can I stop you for a moment? I think the connection is breaking up. We're going to finish in a few moments, but I think this is a good question and a great answer. Could we try the hotspot just for a moment?
Yeah, let me see if we can turn that on there for you.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
First slot. see here.
I think it's a good question, a great answer. So want to make sure we don't miss it. Hopefully we'll get Matt back in a moment. Meanwhile, we can everybody complimented for the cup, so we can celebrate the cup. I guess I can try to answer that because it's for both of us. So while we get Matt back, I can try to answer. Yeah, Matt is gonna take a few moments. So yeah, I'll answer my take, and yeah, Matt is back. Okay, let's see. Yes, looks like it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. So I think that what makes a good teacher is somebody who really cares about teaching and puts a lot of time and thought and energy into being able to pass on the information to students. That's the most important thing. More important than how good they are at the particular skill set, I think, is how much care they have in themselves for passing it on. What makes a good student is, number one, being coachable. So you'll hear myself and all the other coaches, whether we're talking about a fighter or just your average student, they're coachable or they're not coachable. And when one of us says it, we know what that means. But what that means really is I can impart some information. I can give a student correction, and they hear it and they apply it. And that's the most important thing for being a good student. And there's a lot of reasons why people aren't coachable. Sometimes they're not coachable because they just don't listen. Sometimes people are not coachable because in the gym they care more about winning than they do learning jiu-jitsu. So I'll give you an example. If you have somebody who's big and strong and athletic, and they're training with people, they're all white belts, and they're training with other white belts who maybe aren't as big and strong and athletic as them, they will be able to get away with doing certain things to those other students when they're rolling and training that when they do it against that small purple belt over there in the corner, they're going to lose the match because they do it. And a jiu-jitsu instructor like myself or somebody else will go over to them, and in my case, I'll go over to them, I'll explain to them, don't do that. Here's why. I want them to understand why not to do that. If you do that, this guy over here will do this because you've left yourself open. I realize it works here, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea for your game. And then I'll walk away, and then that student either corrects that habit, in which case they're going to have a really good learning curve, or they ignore me because they care more about beating that other white belt right now than they do the art of jiu-jitsu. And so I think in the long run, that's what makes a good student. And ironically, well, it's not ironic really, but I've said this before. I think having taught jiu-jitsu now for almost 30 years, women learn jiu-jitsu better and quicker in general than men do. And the reason for that, I think, is primarily because they're more coachable. If I say that to a woman, she'll listen to what I have to say. It's logical or not logical, makes sense. She won't make that mistake again. She just consciously try not to make that mistake again. Whereas oftentimes, unfortunately, as men, our egos get in our way, and we'll continue making a mistake if we think we can maybe make that mistake work at some point, and that just wastes time.
Yeah, what you're saying, just to quickly chip in as well, it reminds me of this phrase that it's about those are the people who care more about learning than winning.
Yes.
That naturally reminds me also of John Diggins, one of your black belts, who always gives out his back or gets himself in difficult situations just to kind of progress, I think. And I actually recently learned that GSP also apparently does that. So yeah, I think
a very good percentage of people who are very good at jiu-jitsu do that. And if people listen to what Rickson talks about, that's what he talks about doing. Is you got to intentionally put yourself in tough spots so you can learn.
And I think even like in your recent talk with Randy, I think he mentioned he used to do that as well, if I'm not mistaken.
All the time. all the time. Randy would, he was mad at himself for doing it with the Josh Barnett fight. But like we said there, it's, there's a plus side and a negative side to everything. I also think that that's why he won the fight against Kevin Randleman, because Randy had a guard. Because there was very few, probably no one in my gym, including me for sure, that could put Randy on his back consistently if we wanted to. Definitely not me. Maybe Henderson sometimes, maybe Matt Lindland, but if Randy wanted to stay on top in training camp, Randy's going to stay on top in training camp. So he had to intentionally choose to play off his back, and he did for years, and he developed a guard. And then all of a sudden, when he found himself taken down against Randleman, he was able to survive and even almost submit him. And then, like you talked about, at the end of that fight, Randy took Randleman down, and Randleman had no guard. You could just tell Randleman was not used to being on his back. Probably never goes on his back in training camp. And so, like Randy said, he did the dead cockroach. He just had his legs and arms sticking up in the air. And Randy just took, I think, knee ride and finished him. And so that's the difference. Randy would put himself in tough spots all the time to learn. That's somebody who cares more about learning than they do winning that particular day in the gym. And smart athletes, smart competitive and professional athletes understand that what happens in the gym doesn't matter. What you're doing in the gym is just training for the fight. So, you want to be in a position where you're losing over and over again. Like I try and explain to new students when they start jiu-jitsu or any functional martial art, losing is not just okay, it is an essential part of the process. It's essential. If you're not losing on a consistent basis, you're not learning in a functional martial art. You're not putting yourself in a position in training with aliveness in a way that is optimum yet. To do that, you're going to be losing all the time. I tap out all the time. Everybody does, and that's the only way you get good.
Yeah. And relating that with our subject about Jeet Kune Do, Aikido, the traditional martial arts, I think I have an impression that many of these people who move from the traditional martial arts or fantasy-based martial arts to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, often they're not the good students because they want to prove and they feel like they feel superior because they had like a black belt and it's difficult for them to lose. So did you ever have those students yourself where somebody comes with a baggage?
Oh, sure. But they don't last, right? If they last, they have to let go of that, because that's brutal on your ego. As you know, when you first start Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, no matter who you are, who you think you are, when you're a white belt and you go in there, even if you have some wrestling, you're going to get beat over and over and over again. You have to just kind of accept that. And you not only accept it, you have to be cool with it, and you have to be calm, and you have to handle yourself well, especially in a gym like mine with the culture I have. Nobody's going to want to train with you if you don't. You're going to get weeded out. So, they may put up with that for like a week or 2 weeks. And after a while, it's like, dude, just get used to it. You're not who you thought you were. You want to get there. This is how you have to get there. And so, they usually straighten up right away or they quit.
Right. It seems like there's no middle ground in that place.
No middle ground.
And yeah, do you want to add something else? Or
well, the only other thing I was going to say is that also, reminds me sometimes, like I said earlier, where Dan Inosanto would say all arts have something good. That's only true if you don't add, if you're not specific. If we talk about being in a fight, that's not true. And proof positive of that is, as a coach over the years, I would much rather, if I was going to teach somebody how to fight MMA, for example, I would much rather have a student come to me who had no training, usually, than somebody who came to me with lots of Aikido or lots of Wing Chun or lots of very traditional karate, because all that happens then is I have a whole bunch of bad habits I have to correct, right? It's not just that they don't know how to fight, it's that they've learned how to fight the wrong way. And now you have to unwind and unwrap a whole bunch of stuff to get them back just to where the person who walks in off the street, who's just a basic white belt who's never done anything, is. And so, that's an example of how some fantasy-based martial arts actually take you further away from the goal, not closer to it.
Very quickly, that reminds me of a question I forgot to ask, and you kind of covered it right now, but I think it's interesting to mention. You said that some martial arts can actually make you worse at fighting. And can you elaborate a little bit about why that is so?
Sure. Well, I just gave you an example of that. Coming in, I'll give you a more specific example. I don't know if I told you this story before. I wrote about this story in my book, but a long time ago, we had a guy come in to do a challenge match. We didn't have a lot of those, but we've had a few. You know, when the UFC first started, we had a few, and then they died off over the years. But we've had a few. And this guy came in, smaller guy, not very big. He was maybe 5'6", and he's Wing Chun instructor. Been training a long time. He was very offended. It's something I'd said somewhere about Wing Chun, and he wanted to fight. And I said, yeah, you know, we can fight if you want to fight. Mind you, now I'm like, at the time was probably 260 pounds, and he looked like he was about 160. So I said, like, if you really want to do that, I'll do that with you. And I turned around, and he just happened to walk in during MMA comp team. And so as I'm saying, you and I could do that. Or as I say, or as the word or gets out of my mouth, there's like 10 150-pound below fighters just like chomping at the bit to get in the cage with this guy, get in the ring with this guy. And so he kind of looked at that, and he's like, well, no, not right now. I'll come back. Well, okay, you can come back. And I never thought too much about it. I think a week later, I get a call. I'm at home. It's my day off. Matt, that guy came back, and he's with this huge guy. He's like taller than you and heavier, and they want to fight. I'm like, okay, I'll be right there. So I get in my car. I'm taping my hands while I'm driving. It took me maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes to get from my house at the time to the gym on MLK. And by the time I got into the gym, Rick Davison, you know Rick, was at the time probably 160 pounds and a purple belt and an amateur MMA fighter. Rick had gotten in the cage, a ring. We had a boxing ring at the time, gotten in the ring with these guys. So it was a smaller guy, and he brought this huge guy who was about my height, 6'7", 6'8", but probably 300 pounds. Just a massive dude. And Rick had been Ironmanning him. Rick put on MMA gloves. They got to put on MMA gloves. They were fighting whatever those guys wanted to do, and Rick would take them down, slap them a little bit, submit them, take them down, and then he would trade. So by the time I got to the gym, like 15 minutes later, he'd beaten both of them like 6 times in a row. And it was amazing to watch. And long story short, the big guy turned out to be very cool with it. Because why would you not be? Here's a guy that's 150 pounds. He's just gently, Rick was being nice to him. He wasn't bashing him on the head when he took him down. He was submitting him nicely. He's getting manhandled by this 150-pound guy. Like, that guy wanted to sign up for classes. He's like, well, when can I come back? Would you mind if I train? It's like, no, you're welcome. The smaller guy who was an instructor, who'd been doing Wing Chun for like 20 years, was not so cool with it. And he had a bunch of excuses. So the first one was, well, the gloves restrict my trapping abilities. We're like, well, you can take the gloves off if you want. Take the gloves off if you want. And then the second one was, well, every time we fight, he just takes me down to the ground and submits me. And I'm like, well, yeah, he's being nice to you. You're not wearing gloves, you know. He's being, I mean, if you don't want to do it. So I look at Rick and I'm like, Rick, this time beat him with punches. Don't take him down. And the guy's like, no, that's okay. And just so people understand what was going on here, these guys, not so much the big guy, but the smaller Wing Chun guy, they would start the round, and the Wing Chun guy would try and take Rick's head off. Try as hard as he could to hit Rick as hard as he could in the head. Rick would just gently pick him up, take him down. Guy would throw his arms up because he didn't want to get punched in the face, and Rick would submit him. They would break, and then here comes this guy again, trying to take Rick's head off. So he's getting opportunity after opportunity to legitimately try and hurt Rick, which is what he wanted to do. And Rick is gently controlling him and finishing him on the ground. And I don't think the message came through that, you know, he's just being nice to you, until I said, okay, this time when you take him down, Rick, make him submit from punches. And he's like, oh, okay. Well, and then he stormed off into the bathroom and he left. Now, going back to what I talked about, where some arts can make you worse, I will guarantee you, even if that guy had a good attitude, attitude aside, let's say he was coachable. He came back to me. He was humble. He's like, I really want to learn what you have to offer. After doing 20 years of that style of Wing Chun, there's so many things I would have had to fix. The way he stood, the way he threw punches, his body mechanics. I would say he was trying to knock Rick's head off, but it's not like he was a legit threat because he couldn't throw a punch if he wanted to. He had no understanding of how to put weight behind his, none of that stuff. So because he'd been trained in this fantasy-based martial art, he'd moved himself further away from even in the subset of what he thought he could do, which was stand up. He knew he couldn't fight on the ground, but he thought he could fight standing, and he couldn't. And so even if he was humble and he came to me, we would have to unlearn all that. It's that, the cliche about the empty cup, but it is very true. And in that case, I would have preferred he just walked in and had no training whatsoever, and he probably would have learned so much faster.
Yeah, that's a great story. And the very last question for today, and this one comes from me. So let's say you get a chance to write a message which will reach all of the fantasy-based martial artists, and they will definitely read it. It doesn't necessarily mean they will believe it, but they will think about it and sincerely consider it. What message or question would you write to them?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I would say pursue truth no matter what.
Okay. Any elaboration you could quickly say for everyone else who's listening?
I think that my thought is they'd read that and be like, well, what's he mean, pursue truth? And if I were to expand on it, I would say test what you're doing. Test what you're doing, and then pursue truth no matter what. The thing about martial arts, I love martial arts. You love martial arts. We like talking about martial arts. We talk about critical thinking in martial arts and stuff like that. But it's really like critical thinking in the martial arts. My job is pretty easy, right? It's not like it's not as difficult as it would be if we were talking about alternative medicine, or worse, if we're talking about metaphysical beliefs and religion. And the reason why it's easy is because fantasy-based martial arts are delusion made physical, and they are so easily testable. Everything that anybody that's listening to us right now that's doing a fantasy-based martial art, I don't want you to get beat up. It's not a threat. I'm not telling you to go in and challenge your local MMA school. Don't do that. But with a little intelligence and a little bit of equipment, you can figure out how to test what you're doing. 100%, whether it's Aikido or Wing Chun or Shaolin Kung Fu or Flying Monkey, whatever it is, you can figure out how to test what you're doing. Now, if you're really interested in truth, test what you're doing. And then pursue truth no matter what. If you find out that what you're doing is bullshit, let it go. Let it go and move on to something else, because that's good for people when we do that. It's good for people when we have that level of integrity, even with something as unimportant in the relative scheme of things as martial arts.
Nice. Perfect. That's great. So I'll put a wrap here, and just want to say thank you again very much for your time and for everything you do, and for bringing me to critical thinking in martial arts. It changed my life literally. So thank you for everything, and so thank you everyone as well who's watching. I'll end the broadcast right now, and we still have we can still